All right, hello everyone. We are going to start the endocrine system today, chapter 13. It is going to be a long one. So we'll start out with some roots, prefixes, and suffixes that you'll need to know for the endocrine system. Some of them that you already know. Endo means inside. Exo means outside. Hyper means above, hypo means below. All right. So just some general characteristics of the endocrine system. Basically, the endocrine system and the nervous system are going to kind of work hand in hand to perform the function. They're very, very interrelated in order to maintain homeostasis. Remember, homeostasis is that body zen to maintain that natural internal that constant state of well-being, and also coordinate information within the body. It is a unique system in that not all the organs are connected anatomically. Usually, like with the cardiovascular system, the heart and the blood vessels are connected together. The nervous system is connected together. The respiratory system, it's all connected together. With the endocrine system, all the organs are kind of spread out. You have your adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys, and your pancreas is kind of like in the underneath your left rib cage. You have glands in your brain. You can see some of the major endocrine glands, your pituitary gland that's in your brain, your thyroid gland, parathyroid glands. Those are going to be kind of like in your neck area. Adrenal glands, I said, were on your kidney. Pineal gland is in your brain. Ovaries and testes, those are your reproductive organs. Down ovaries are in your pelvic area, testes. I hope by now you know where your testes are, males. All right, so here you can see where the glands are located. Okay, so more characteristics. So we have endocrine glands and exocrine glands that make up the endocrine system. Endocrine glands, endocrine just means internal secretion. They dump their gunk or their substance into, typically it says body fluid. So typically that's going to be like a bloodstream. They are ductless. So when they dump whatever they're dumping, they're going to dump their stuff into a body fluid. And then these hormones, we'll talk about hormones later on. These hormones are going to go in through these body fluids, typically the bloodstream, and they're going to act on these target cells that have receptors on them. And a target cell is just a cell that has a receptor for a specific hormone. And receptors are just made from proteins or glycoproteins. Exocrine glands are glands that secrete through a duct or a tube to a free apical surface. Like your sweat glands secrete to the outside surface, like to your skin, so they can secrete like externally. Your gastric, some of your digestive enzymes or hormones secrete stuff to a specific area inside a hollow space that's inside your gut. So that would be a free or apical surface. And we have these cells that secrete these chemical messengers internally. We call them local hormones, but they're not actually hormones. They're called paracrine cells and autocrine cells, or paracrine secretions and autocrine secretions. And paracrine secretions are going to affect cells that are nearby. So, for example, like white blood cells can secrete histamine, which would dilate nearby blood vessels. Autocrine secretions are produced within one tissue and they're regulated in another tissue within the same organ. So, for example, when there's damage to the liver, some cells need to be produced, and the liver can use this autocrine signaling process. Special chemicals are secreted from the cells of the liver and they act on the same cell, making cell division possible. Or the base layer of cancer cells, they have some genetic material that sends one chemical to the same cell, starting the replication process, and that's how tumors form in the body. So here are some different types of glands that do that kind of show the difference between endocrine and exocrine. So the thyroid gland, for example, will secrete their hormones directly into the bloodstream. So the thyroid gland is an endocrine gland, whereas sweat glands, they will dump out their contents into these ducts, or this duct is kind of like a hollow area. So that would be an exocrine gland. And if you remember from AMP1, we had the merocrine, the apocrine, and the holocrine, different types of exocrine secretions. And depending on how much cellular debris came off, was how we categorized if it was a merocrine, apocrine, or holocrine. All right, so characteristics between the nervous system and endocrine system. Remember I said that they are very, very much interrelated. That both systems they both communicate with via chemicals that bind to receptor molecules. Remember that the nervous system releases neurotransmitters into synapses. We talked about acetylcholine, norepinephrine. Nervous system travels a very short distance. Remember, we have that synapse and that synaptic cleft, and we had the one neuron connected to the other neuron, or we had a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron, or we had the presynaptic neuron, and then we had that skeletal muscle. So those nervous system, those neurotransmitters only travel a very short distance. The endocrine system can travel a short distance or far away. If it's released from your thyroid gland and has to go all the way to your big toe, or to your kidneys, or to wherever cell it needs to go, it has to travel through your bloodstream, so it can circulate long distances. The nervous system is going to respond much quicker than the endocrine system. You say when you start walking, your nervous system is going to contract your skeletal muscle rather quickly. It doesn't take any time at all, but if you have to adjust your blood glucose level, your body doesn't like sudden changes in your body. So it's going to take a while to get your blood glucose level down to normal. Or if you have a temperature of 103 degrees, and if the endocrine system has a part to play in that, then you're not going to go from 103 degrees back down to 98.6. So once remember, like when we talked about a skeletal muscle contraction, we had acetylcholine, and then we had acetylcholinesterase that breaks up the acetylcholine. Once that acetylcholine is gone, the nervous system is done contracting the skeletal muscle. So the effects of the nervous system are pretty much quick on, quick off. Whereas with the endocrine system, those effects can last a lot longer than those of the nervous system. And here's just like a summary chart of kind of what we just talked about. And when it says, while it says that the duration of action may be brief, or it may last for days, even if secretion ends. Typically, um, hormones only last a relatively short amount of time. Rarely do hormones take days to work. What this slide is meaning by lasting for days, even if secretion ceases, is called half-life. You will need to know this comparison chart and how to interpret the differences between the nervous system and endocrine system. So speaking of half-life, half-life is just the interval of time required for one half of the hormone or medication or whatever we're talking about to be used up. So for example, if we have we'll be talking about a medication here. So let's say, and we can talk about a hormone. You can insert medication for hormone, but let's say we have 250 milligrams of a certain medication that has a half-life of 30 minutes. So when we have a half-life of 30 minutes, basically all we're going to do is come over here and we're just going to do our time at time. Whoop, I was trying to get my pen. There we go. Time 0, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 120, 150, and 180. And then, so our percentage, we're just going to divide, we're just going to chop it in half every 30 minutes. So we're going to start out with 100% of the drug. And then after 30 minutes, we're going to have 50% of the drug left. After 60 minutes, we're going to have 50 divided by 2 is 25. After 90 minutes, 25 divided by 2 is 12 and a half. After 120 minutes, 12 and a half divided by 2 is 6.25. 6.25 divided by 2 is 3.125. Divided by 2 is 1.5625. So that's the percentage of drug remaining after X number of time. So when it comes to how many milligrams are remaining, we started out with 250 milligrams. So we're going to start out with 250 milligrams, and we just keep dividing by 2. 250 divided by 2 is 125, divided by 2, divided by 2, divided by 2, divided by 2, divided by 2. So if I said, what percentage of the drug is remaining after 150 minutes, you can come and say, oh, at 150 minutes, we only have 3.125% of the drug remaining. Okay, if I said, how many milligrams are remaining after 120 minutes? After 120 minutes, we have 15.625 milligrams of the drug remaining. And that's just kind of how you interpret this chart. There will be one question like this on the exam. It's not going to be, I can promise you, you're not going to have to go down to the 3.90625. It's going to be one where you could kind of do it in your head. So I will say that if you have a hormone where its effect does last for days, you can pretty much guess it's going to have a long half-life. So if we're getting down into the, we're only here, 180 minutes. 180 minutes is 3 hours. That's really not a long half-life of 30 minutes. But if we're talking, if we're going into like, let's see, what is, 24 times 3, so 72 hours. If we're going in at 72 hours, which is 3 days, that's going to be a really long half-life. Okay. So this is going back to the slide up here this slide and this slide that I was talking about the more on the traveling a very short distance. You can see that the neurotransmitter, this space is not a big space. So this would be acetylcholine because it looks like we're looking at maybe some skeletal muscle, or because we have some striations here. So this space here is not a big space, whereas in the endocrine system has to travel through the bloodstream, so it's going to be a long way to go. All right, here are some different hormones that we'll be talking about. So sometimes you'll hear people talk about um, corticotropin releasing hormones. Sometimes you'll hear it abbreviated as CRH. Sometimes you'll so hear prolactin releasing inhibiting hormones. Sometimes you'll hear it as PIH. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as dopamine. I can tell you, I have never heard it as prolactin releasing inhibiting hormone. I've never heard it abbreviated as PIH. I've only known it as dopamine. But just know that there are different ways to saying different things. And depending on what field you are in, if you're in, a genetic embryology research field, you might call it something different because that might pertain to your field. Whereas if you're in, an A&P class, you might call it something different because that's what their field is going to typically call something. So for example, I know it as growth hormone and I abbreviate it as GH, but other fields I've heard it called somatotropin. So it depends on where you work as to what you're going to call it. But just know that a lot of different that different hormones have different names for the exact same thing. Now here I'll just point out it says prolactin releasing factor, PRF. I just have this up here. Factor is used because the specific prolactin releasing hormone has not yet been identified. So we're just going to call it prolactin releasing factor, even though we really haven't been able to isolate it or kind of really identify it. So just kind of start committing these to memory. Where they are. The source is going to be, these are going to be coming from the hypothalamus. These are going to be coming from the anterior pituitary. These are going to be coming from the posterior pituitary. These are your thyroid hormones, your parathyroid, adrenal medulla, adrenal cortex, and your pancreas hormones. So I will say, antidiuretic hormone. I call it antidiuretic hormone. I call it ADH, and I call it vasopressin. So for you future nurses, if you're working in a cardiac unit, you'll call it all three. If you're talking about a hormone, you're going to be calling it antidiuretic hormone or ADH. There is a medicine out there called vasopressin, and you can give it in IV form, and basically it's just an IV form of ADH. So if you're giving it as a medication, you're probably going to say vasopressin and not ADH. So thyroxine, your thyroid hormones, thyroxine, and triiodine thionine. Typically, we just say T3 and T4. Parathyroid hormone or PTH. I would say most people do not say parathormone. Most people just say PTH. You'll hear epinephrine and norepinephrine. You might hear epi. All epinephrine is just adrenaline. So you drink a Red Bull, or you have an adrenaline rush. That's basically epinephrine, and we'll talk about that later on. Cortisol, hydrocortisone, you have hydrocortisone cream that you put on when you get a bee sting or something like that. Hydrocortisone cream, that's basically a synthetic version of cortisol. Okay, so like I said, just start committing those to memory and figuring out, where is everything released. You're gonna have to know. Those. So hormones. Remember that hormones have an effect on another cell, and I should say has a metabolic effect on another cell. Only because, and I'll actually move this one up. Typically, because they stimulate growth, reproduction, and development. And I'll correct my mistake there. And remember, hormones are released into extracellular fluid, whether it be tissue fluid, the bloodstream. We say that either hormones are water soluble or lipid soluble. Remember that, water and oil, they don't mix. So if we have lipid soluble hormones, then in order for those to travel in the bloodstream, they have to be kind of packaged in a different way. And we'll talk about that later on. Hormones, very powerful in low concentrations. It doesn't take a lot of hormone in order to do the job. Hormones can regulate water balance, electrolyte balance, blood pressure. Hormones do a lot of things within our body. Hormones, they exert their effect, like I said, by altering the metabolic process. And there's two ways that they can do that. They can alter the enzyme activity of what's going on, and they can change the rate of membrane transport of a substance. And remember that they will, these cells have the receptors on the target cell. And it says on/in, and we'll talk about the difference between a first messenger and a second messenger later on. But we have these receptors on and in a target cell. And not all hormones are going to work on all cells. It says hormones are only going to affect those target cells that have those receptors that are unique for that specific hormone. So if we're talking about let's find one here. Okay, so if we're talking about this growth hormone releasing hormone, this GHRH, that's actually going to work on the anterior pituitary to actually release this thing called growth hormone. So that the anterior pituitary is going to have receptors on it for this GHRH. So, if we're talking about a cell in the big toe, it's not going to have receptors for this GHRH hormone. Only the anterior pituitary will. All right, so hormones, like I said, work in extremely low concentrations and they cause changes in target cells. So we're going to talk about upregulation and downregulation. So it says the number of receptors determine the strength of response. So if we have a lot, so I'll just read. It says upregulation. So it's basically an increase in number of receptors available for binding on a target cell in response to a prolonged decreased concentration of a hormone. And downregulation would be the opposite, a decrease in number of receptors available for binding on target cell in response to a prolonged increased concentration of a hormone. So basically what upregulation, downregulation is that if you have a prolonged high concentration of a hormone, that cell will say, you know what, I don't need so many receptors because I have a lot of drug available. So the cell can actually get rid of some of those receptors. So if we have too much hormone, the cell is going to get rid of some of those receptors on the cell. And we say that that would be downregulation. Now, on the flip side, if we don't have enough hormone, the cell only has, let's say, it's not going to be 3 receptors, but let's say, we need more receptors on the cell will create more receptors on the cell to try and catch that low concentration of hormone. If the cell is creating more receptors, we would say that that is upregulation. Because of the low concentration of hormone, the cell's trying the cell will create more receptors in hopes that it can bind more of that hormone, and that's just upregulation. All right, so hormones are organic compounds. Remember, organic compounds are carbon and hydrogen, or organic compounds contain carbon and hydrogen. We can break up organic compounds into steroid or steroid-like hormones, and we can break them up in non-steroid hormones. So steroid hormones are lipid soluble. They are lipid-like, and so therefore they're not water soluble, or they're water insoluble. Steroids are derived from cholesterol, and they are going to they're directly related to protein synthesis. We can see these in your sex hormones, like your testosterone, your estrogens, your adrenal cortex hormones, cortisol, aldosterone, your non-steroid hormones. We have different categories of non-steroid hormones. Amines. Amines are going to be derived from tyrosine, which is an amino acid, hence the name amine, such as epinephrine, norepinephrine, thyroxine, or it can be derived from tryptophan, which is another amino acid, such as melatonin. Non-steroid hormones can be classified as proteins. Remember, proteins are just long chains of amino acids. So parathyroid hormone or growth hormone would be classified as a protein. Glycoproteins are just carbohydrates joined together with another protein. So like your TSH, your thyroid stimulating hormone, would be an example. Peptides. Peptides are just short chains of amino acids. So your posterior pituitary gland hormones, your ADH, your antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, those are your two posterior gland hormones. TRH, and you're going to say, well, what's TRH? TRH, remember, is your, wrong slide, TRH up here, thyrotropin releasing hormone. And we'll talk more about these hormones later on. All right, and it says cause activation of adenylate cyclase. We're going to hold off on that bullet point later on. I mentioned earlier we have first messengers and second messengers. Adenylate cyclase is, we'll talk about that when we talk about second messengers. Here's just kind of like a summary chart of different amines, peptides, proteins, glycoproteins, steroids. So you're going to have to know, kind of what falls under what category. We'll talk a little bit more about, each of these hormones later on. Remember, proteins are long chains of amino acids. Peptides are short chains of amino acids. All right, here in this top left, that's going to be cortisol. So you can see the cortisol is going to be a steroid. Remember, steroids are derived from cholesterol, and so it's going to be lipid soluble. The second one is norepinephrine. Norepinephrine, that's an amine. So you can kind of see this little amine group here. That's your amine. Parathyroid hormone, PTH. Remember, that's a long chain of amino acids. There's a bunch of amino acids linked together, so that's going to be a protein. And oxytocin, part D, that's a short chain of amino acids, so that's going to be a peptide. And the bottom picture is a prostaglandin. Here you can see that terminal COOH there. All right, so steroid hormones, and we'll talk about thyroid hormones. So even though thyroid hormones fall under the amine group, we'll still classify them. We'll still throw them under the steroid-like hormones. They're going to be soluble in lipids. So they have poor water solubility. Remember, I said that if you're lipid soluble, you have to be packaged a little bit differently in order to travel through the blood. Remember, blood is water soluble, so they're going to be bound to these plasma proteins. These hydrophilic or water-loving plasma proteins, they're going to kind of be packaged inside of these plasma proteins. So you're going to have like the water portion on the outside, and then inside you're going to have your fat-soluble lipid hormone, or your steroid hormone, or your amine hormone. And then on the outside you're going to have this plasma protein that's going to go around through the bloodstream. And the good thing about this is that once it gets to the kidney, they're not going to filter out large proteins. So, this protein won't get filtered out, and it will still continue in the bloodstream and hopefully get to wherever it needs to get to. And then once it gets to wherever it needs to get to, the good thing is that it'll kind of break up, and then it'll kind of leave that plasma protein. And because that lipid bilayer, remember that the cell is the lipid bilayer, it can actually, because it's this hormone is lipid soluble, it can actually penetrate or diffuse through the lipid bilayer of cell membranes. So some of the steroid hormones, testosterone, estradiol, progesterone, aldosterone. You can see a lot of them are the ones that end in ONE. Cortisol is another one. So your ONE ones, testosterone, progesterone, aldosterone, and then estradiol, and then cortisol would be some steroid hormones. So thyroid hormones and amines are kind of thought to enter the cell by the same method. Some of your thyroid hormones, there's 3 of them, T3, T4, or if we wanted to call them something, other than T3, T4, T3 is actually called triiodothyronine, and T4 is called tetraiodothyronine. So T3, T4, and then the third one's called calcitonin. And we'll talk about the thyroid hormones later. So both of these are going to the steroids and the thyroid hormones are going to bind to this this thing called an intercellular receptor, and it's just basically a protein receptor that's usually in the nucleus. And some things are going to happen. The first is that once we have this bound complex, this hormone receptor complex, it's going to bind to the DNA sequence, and it's either going to activate or repress the gene. And if it activates the gene, then we're going to cause this transcription process. Remember, DNA replication, translation, transcription that we learned last semester. So it's going to cause this transcription process of converting, mRNA and all that stuff, and we're going to cause a change in gene expression. And then that protein synthesis will actually lead to the action of the hormone. So this hormone is going to come into the cell, bind to the cell, come in, attach itself to the nucleus, cause this mRNA translation process to happen. This gene is going to be expressed. We're going to create a protein. That protein is going to leave the nucleus, going to leave the cell, and the hormone, and then we're going to see the action of the hormone. And this is just a kind of a stepwise process of what we just mentioned. The endocrine gland is going to secrete that hormone. The blood carries the molecule through the body. That hormone diffuses through the target membrane, enters through the cytoplasm or the nucleus that combines with that receptor molecule, the steroid hormone, binds to the DNA, promotes transcription of mRNA. mRNA causes the protein synthesis, and that newly synthesized protein produces that hormone's effects. And here you can just see the stepwise process of what happens. All right, so for non-steroid hormones, and this is going to be the rest of the amines, your peptides, and your protein hormones, because they are water soluble, they cannot cross that cell membrane. Remember, that cell membrane is a lipid bilayer, it's lipid soluble. So that hormone is going to be bind to the receptor on those cell membranes. And this is where that first messenger and second messenger come into play that I was talking about earlier. So that hormone binding, that hormone is considered that first messenger. It's going to bind to that cell membrane, and it's going to activate this thing called a G protein. And then we have this chemical inducing change that's going to cause this second messenger. And the synthesis of the second messenger is how this non-steroidal hormone is going to affect the change in that target cell. So this second messenger, the second messenger typically is going to be cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or cyclic AMP, or CAMP, or CAMP. So this cyclic AMP, we'll say, is the second messenger. And I said, we talked about adenylate cyclase earlier, and I said, we'll hold off on that bullet point for a second. So what we're doing with adenylate cyclase is we're taking ATP, remember adenosine triphosphate, and in the presence of adenylate cyclase, we'll take ATP in the presence of adenylate cyclase, we'll create a MP, adenosine monophosphate, and we'll get rid of two phosphate groups off of the ATP. So, we have adenosine phosphate, 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 and in the presence of adenylate cyclase, what we're going to do is we're going to break it off right here, and we're going to create adenosine monophosphate plus 2 phosphates. That's all we're doing. We're taking adenosine triphosphate and going to adenosine monophosphate. So that's just what an adenylate cyclase does. So now we've created this cyclic AMP, and cyclic just means in a circle. So adenosine, cyclic AMP is what we call a second messenger. And the second messenger, so this entire process is called signal transduction, how the hormone binds to the receptors on the cell membrane, activates the protein, the G protein, comes in and kind of creates this cyclic AMP. That's all called signal transduction. So I'll kind of summarize. So a hormone binds to its receptor, and the resulting hormone receptor complex activates a protein called G protein. G protein is an enzyme complex that is joined to the intracellular side of the hormone receptor, and it is the link between that first messenger and the second messenger. This activated G protein moves along the inside of the plasma membrane and binds to an enzyme called adenylate cyclase, which is an integral membrane protein with its active site facing inside the cell. Activated adenylate cyclase removes 2 phosphates from ATP and forms AMP in a cyclic pattern. Cyclic AMP activates another enzyme called protein kinases, and these protein kinases transfers these phosphate groups from ATP to from the ATP molecules to protein substrate molecules in a process called phosphorylation. And phosphorylation activates some proteins and renders other proteins inactive. And the phosphorylated proteins, after various cellular processes, brings about the effect of that particular hormone. So an example of this would be epinephrine uses cyclic AMP to activate to increase the activity of the enzyme that breaks down liver glycogen, increasing the number of glucose molecules to provide energy. We can have cyclic AMP abnormalities. So there's a disease out there, syndrome out there called McCune-Albright syndrome. Basically, it's a defect in this G protein that activates adenylate cyclase, converting ATP to cyclic AMP. And this results in excess secretion of certain pituitary, thyroid hormones, gonadal hormones, or adrenal hormones, and it can lead to precocious puberty, and that's basically where females can menstruate or males can produce sperm as young as like 6 years old. And I mentioned that cyclic AMP acts as a second messenger. We have different other second messengers as well besides cyclic AMP. We can use this DAG, this diacylglycerol, or IP3, inositol triphosphate, or there's another compound called cyclic GMP, cyclic guanosine monophosphate. So we have different second messengers out there. So Just know that cyclic AMP is just not the only one. All right, and I realized that I kind of forgot one bullet point. I never finished the slide, so I just added in this sentence, how or this bullet that cyclic AMP activates protein kinases, which leads to phosphorylation, which leads to the hormone effect. And then just remember that this entire process is called signal transduction. All right, so here is just a summary slide of kind of what we just talked about. And here is a picture version of kind of what we just talked about. You know, the non-steroidal reaches the target cell, binds to the cell membrane, activates the G protein, adenylate cyclase, cyclic AMP, and then we had that phosphorylation, and that leads to cellular changes and development of protein kinases. All right. All right, so we talked several chapters ago about abusing certain drugs, but we haven't talked about, steroids yet. So steroids can be used to increase, muscular strength. It does have some harmful effects. Obviously we don't want to abuse any drug. So, don't do it. But when you abuse steroids, you can actually stunt your growth. Long-term use, you can see breast development in males. You can see male characteristics in females. You can actually damage your kidneys, liver, heart, have issues with your cholesterol, and obviously create psychiatric problems if you've heard of like roid rage. People do abuse growth hormone or human growth hormone. It is used to enlarge muscles and decrease fat, but it does not improve strength. So some people think that, oh, well, I'll just take this growth hormone to improve strength. It actually does not improve your strength. And some people not to advocate for abusing drugs, but people will often abuse steroids in conjunction with growth hormone, because steroids will improve your strength, and growth hormone will increase your muscle mass as well. But growth hormone does signal the release of IGF from the liver. Erythropoietin, that's what the drug is, or the hormone is, that will increase the number of red blood cells. So when we talk about anemia, which is basically a deficiency of red blood cells, erythropoietin will get produced. The hormone erythropoietin will get produced and will stimulate the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. And we have this in medication form. Medication, there's different forms of medication, but Epogen is one of them. And people will take erythropoietin to increase the number of red blood cells, and hopefully in turn will increase their oxygen delivery to muscles, which will improve their athletic performance. One thing that, obviously it's advised not to do that. It actually can lead to heart attacks and death. All right, prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are paracrine substances. Remember, paracrine substances, they affect nearby cells, so they're going to act locally. Again, they're very potent in small amounts, just like hormones. They are lipid soluble. They are synthesized from this thing called arachidonic acid. in the cell membrane. They are not stored in cells, but they are synthesized just before release. They're rapidly inactivated after use, um, and they can activate or inhibit that cyclic AMP that would talk that adenylate cyclase to control that second messenger hormone, cyclic AMP, that we talked about a few slides ago, to change a cell's response to a specific hormone. Prostaglandins have a lot of effects. We can contract smooth muscle, like in your airways of your lungs or blood vessels. So like menstrual cramps or contractions for labor as well. Relax the smooth muscle, so you can relax your lung airways or your blood vessels. Stimulate or inhibit secretions. Your adrenal cortex hormones. You could stimulate your adrenal cortex hormones, or inhibit your stomach acid hormones. Regulates blood pressure. So it regulates blood pressure by sodium, by influencing the sodium and water movement in the kidneys. Remember that wherever sodium goes, water will follow. So if we hold on to sodium, we're going to hold on to water. If we get rid of sodium in the urine, we're going to pee out more water. So wherever sodium goes, water will follow. So if we have high blood pressure, what the body will want to do is get rid of sodium, because water will follow. And if we get rid of blood volume, theoretically our blood pressure will decrease. If we have low blood pressure, your body will hold on to sodium and therefore retain water, increasing your blood volume, and your blood pressure will go up, not grow up. And I can get rid of this bullet point. We've already said controlling movement, sodium, water. All right, promoting inflammation, medical applications. So NSAIDs. Aspirin, Tylenol, cortisone, that can relieve, joint pain, rheumatoid arthritis, by inhibiting the production of prostaglandins in the synovial fluid of affected joints. This is also why people take a low dose aspirin to prevent heart attacks. All right, control of hormone secretions. It is precisely regulated. Remember acetylcholine and acetylcholinesterase. That's on the neurotransmitter side. So, we're not talking about that. But that's just an example of, the precise regulation. So just like acetylcholine, all of this is a negative feedback. Actually, I don't want to confuse you, so I'll get rid of the acetylcholine and acetylcholinesterase. So the secretion it's precisely regulated, controlled by negative feedback mechanisms. Remember, if something's too high, we're going to lower it. If something's too low, we're going to raise it. And remember back from that chart earlier on in the chapter, the effects are short-lived. However, they may last for days. Most of your hormones are excreted in the urine, and it can be broken down by your liver enzymes to stop the effects of hormones. So I said negative feedback. There are negative feedback is going to be the main way of controlling hormone secretion. There is, a couple applications for positive feedback. We'll get to that in a few slides. But for the main portion, or the 99+% of the time, it's going to be negative feedback. And by now the definition of negative feedback. And this is all going on behind the scenes. We don't know that it's going on. So there's 3 ways that the body can perform this negative feedback. The first one is that the hypothalamus controls the release of anterior pituitary hormones, and then the pituitary hormones secrete the hormones that control the activity of other glands. So if we, so we'll talk about this one for a second. So the hypothalamus controls the release of anterior pituitary hormones, and then the pituitary hormones secrete hormones that control the activity of other glands. And I say tropic hormones. Tropic hormones just means that hormones that stimulate other endocrine glands to secrete hormones. So the hypothalamus controls the release of anterior pituitary hormones, and then the pituitary hormones secrete hormones that control the activity of other glands. So we're going to go back to our chart up here. Okay, so basically what bullet point 1 says, the hypothalamus is going to control the anterior pituitary gland. So here we can say, here we can see growth hormone releasing hormone. Growth hormone. So GnRH will get released by the hypothalamus, and it's going to come down to the anterior pituitary gland, and it's going to stimulate the release of growth hormone. Here we have prolactin releasing factor. So prolactin releasing factor would come to the anterior pituitary to release prolactin. All right. Thyrotropin releasing hormone will come and stimulate the anterior pituitary to release TSH. So that is the example. Those are examples of how the hypothalamus will direct the anterior pituitary to release certain hormones. Now, the anterior pituitary, once the anterior pituitary releases these hormones, so these are tropic hormones, which means they cause a release of another gland to release their hormones. These hormones are going to act on another gland. So the thyroid stimulating hormone will act on the thyroid to release the thyroid hormones. The follicle stimulating hormone will act on the follicles to release what it needs to release. All right. So that is bullet point number 1. All right, nervous system control. The nervous system directly stimulates an endocrine gland to secrete hormones. So here I want you to think of like the fight or flight or in stressful situations. So I said norepinephrine is the preganglionic neurotransmitter. So if you remember from, chapter 11, I believe, we had that slide that has the preganglionic and the postganglionic neurons. All right, I pulled up the notes from chapter 11. If you remember this slide, we had this these autonomic neurotransmitters, and I talked about norepinephrine. I talked about norepinephrine being the neurotransmitter here. But up a couple slides, there was this slide that we talked about. So this is what I'm talking about. This neurotransmitter, the nervous system can actually target the specific gland to secrete certain hormones. All right, and then changes in the internal environment. So changes in plasma levels of a substance can stimulate or inhibit the gland directly. So this is, your blood glucose change. Then the pancreas either dumps out insulin or it doesn't. Your sodium level is out of whack, so then your body's going to either hold on to sodium or not, or get rid of sodium. So these are three different ways that the negative feedback works in our body. So here you can see, for example, the hypothalamus is stimulating the anterior pituitary gland, which stimulates the peripheral endocrine gland that reaches the cell targets to act. And then the peripheral endocrine gland inhibits the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So that's negative feedback. And in the second example, the nervous system is stimulating the endocrine gland secretions that reach the target cells to act. And this action can inhibit the stimulation by the nervous system. In that third example, the changing level of a substance in the plasma stimulates the endocrine gland secretion that reaches the target cell to act, and that action can inhibit the stimulation by the nervous system. So all of these are negative feedback loops. Here you can see the average concentration of the hormone is stable. So it actually fluctuates. It doesn't actually remain constant. Remember this negative feedback loop. So we're always, your temperature doesn't hover at 98.6 constantly. It's going to fluctuate because the body is always trying to, keep it at around 98.6, but it will fluctuate. So here, hormone levels are too high. When hormone levels are too high, hormone exerts its effects. Negative feedback inhibits the system, and the hormone secretion decreases. Then as the hormone levels in the blood decrease and the hormone's effects wane or stops, inhibition of the system ceases and secretion of that hormone increases again. As a result of negative feedback, hormone levels in the bloodstream remain relatively stable, fluctuating slightly around an average value. All right, positive feedback. This is when we make the body worse, and hope that we reset the system, such as with oxytocin, in labor contractions or in breast milk production. You will need to know specific examples of positive versus negative feedback. And really outside of labor contractions and milk production, we're not going to go into other examples of positive feedback. All right, pituitary gland. We can also call the pituitary gland the hypophysis. It's about 1 centimeter in diameter. It lies at the base of the brain in this area called the sella turcica. It is part of the in the sphenoid bone. It's controlled by the brain, and it's considered part of the nervous system. So when we look at the structure of the pituitary gland, you can see it right here. And there's this thing called an infundibulum. It's like the stalk of the pituitary gland. And let's see. All right. Yep. So it's attached to the it's attached to the hypothalamus, and it sits in this little thing called the sella turcica, and it has two different lobes. It has an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe, which the anterior lobe, we also call it an adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe is called a neurohypophysis. The neurohypophysis, or the posterior lobe, is the portion that is actually part of the nervous system. And the secretion from the two lobes is actually controlled by two different methods from the hypothalamus. Um, and the chemicals that are released from the pituitary gland, they are considered hormones because these chemicals are released directly into the bloodstream. I will say that there is a third lobe, even though it says consists of two distinct portions, the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe. In fetal development, we have this intermediate lobe called a pars intermedia. It's a small intermediate lobe called the pars intermedia. It develops in the fetus, and it produces these. It produces. It's called melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH, which regulates the formation of melatonin. But as you can see, in an adult, it's not defined at all. But it would kind of sit right here. Um, so. Um, so in the adult, we really only have two lobes. And so I said that the hypothalamus has two different ways it can regulate the lobe. For the anterior portion, we have these hypothalamic releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones, and they're transported to the anterior lobe through this portal system. It's called the hypophyseal portal system, and it stimulates that anterior lobe to release other hormones. And that's what we talked about up here. When I talk here, this hormone comes on hypothalamus and it stimulates here. This stimulates this. This stimulates this. So that is what I'm talking about for the anterior lobe. So each of these releasing hormones act on a specific group of cells in the anterior pituitary gland, and they can inhibit or stimulate pituitary secretion. All right, so for the posterior lobe, we have, remember, it's part of the nervous system. So we have nerve impulses from the hypothalamus that travel to the posterior lobe through the infundibulum. And remember that infundibulum is that little stalk thing. And that those nerve impulses actually kind of activate the posterior pituitary to release the hormones. So here's the anterior lobe, and you can see that we have this hypophyseal portal system that is going to release hormones. But here we have the nerve impulses. You can see the little synapses right here. All right, so how do the hypothalamus control peripheral endocrine glands? Remember, we had that three-step process. We have releasing or inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary hormones act on cells and peripheral glands. So we have the hypothalamus acting on the anterior pituitary, then the anterior pituitary releases those thyroid hormones to act on the thyroid, for example, to stimulate the thyroid to secrete the hormones. And then the peripheral glands secrete its hormones, which exert effects on its cells. So there's that three-step pathway: hypothalamus to anterior pituitary, anterior pituitary to the hormone. So if we go back up to this slide, this is step one. This is what we're talking about for the anterior pituitary. Remember, those are called tropic hormones. Remember, tropic hormones are hormones that cause or hormones that stimulate other endocrine glands to secrete hormones. All right. And again, negative feedback is involved here. And typically that final hormone is that inhibiting or final pathway for that negative feedback loop. Here's just kind of like another way of showing it. Hypothalamus goes to the anterior pituitary, goes to the peripheral gland, and then once our hormone levels rises, it's going to shut off that hypothalamus and that anterior pituitary from releasing. Oops, I didn't advance your slide. I'm sorry. Once we have that hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary to the peripheral endocrine gland, that hormone is going to shut off that negative feedback loop, because now we have enough hormone to do what we need to do, hopefully. If not, it will continue secreting. All right, so some of your anterior pituitary hormones, remember this one is not released by nervous system. I mean, it's still released by the hypothalamus, but they are the releasing or inhibiting hormones. They are not directly stimulated by the nervous system. That's going to be the posterior side. So some of your anterior pituitary hormones, growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. Dopamine, which is actually released from the hypothalamus, actually inhibits the release of prolactin. So dopamine would inhibit the release of prolactin. All right, so if we go back up to this slide, and what all does what? Let me do some erasing. Okay, so so we have growth hormone. We'll talk about growth hormone for a second. So we have growth hormone. We have GHRH is going to we have GHRH is going to stimulate growth hormone, and somatostatin, look here, growth hormone releasing inhibiting hormone. So somatostatin would be your inhibiting hormone. So growth hormone is stimulated or is released by GHRH, or is inhibited by somatostatin or GHRIH. All right, prolactin. So we'll do orange for prolactin. All right, prolactin. Prolactin is, we don't know, but we're going to assume that prolactin is released by this PRF, this prolactin releasing factor. And we also have this thing called PIH, prolactin inhibiting or prolactin release inhibiting factor, that would inhibit the release of prolactin. All right, thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone would be really all it is stimulated by TRH. We don't have an inhibiting aspect of TSH. If it's not there, it's not going to be released. If TRH is not there, it's not going to be released. Let's see. Oh, what's another one? ACTH, adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone. It's going to be released by corticotropic releasing hormone. And again, it doesn't have an inhibiting factor to it. So once this CRH stops, ACTH will stop as well. All right, so FSH and LH. So those are actually going to be working together by this gonadotropin or gonadotropin releasing hormone. Gonad GnRH is going to stimulate the release of both LH and FSH. And there is no inhibiting hormone, so once GnRH stops, FSH and LH will stop as well. So there's your pretty color-coded slide of what gets released when or inhibited. So that is just kind of like a way of, that's just a summary slide or a picture version of what I did here with this slide. So we're not really going to talk about this slide because I color-coded it for you on the other slide. All right. And this is just another picture version of what happens. So, here it's kind of easy. GHRH is going to stimulate growth hormone. Somatostatin is going to inhibit. PIH is going to stimulate, and we don't have an inhibiting side if PIH is shut off. Prolactin is going to, if we don't, prolactin is going to be released unless we have PIH. I'm sorry, I did that whole backwards. So thyrotropin releasing hormone is going to stimulate TSH. CRH is ACTH. Gonadotropin is going to stimulate both LH and FSH. And you can see the glands or the tissue that it's going to work on. All right. Yeah, so I actually should go back up here and kind of correct myself. Prolactin releasing inhibitory hormone. Oh yeah, I did say it right. I'm sorry. Yeah, PRF, which we don't really know. PRF is going to be the stimulating and PIH is the inhibitory. I did it right. Okay, I'm sorry. Sorry for confusion. All right. Okay. So functions of your anterior pituitary. Growth hormone or somatostatin. Think of your body growing. It stimulates cells to enlarge, to divide. Proteins are amino acids. Proteins is what makes your body grow stronger, bigger, bulkier. That is growth hormones. So increasing your amino acid uptake, enhancing amino acids, moving amino acids inside the cell, protein synthesis. Also, decrease rate of carbohydrate usage. Remember, carbohydrate usage, that is burning energy. So burning energy would be the opposite of growing. And then increased rate of fat usage. If we are using fat, we are getting rid of fat and hopefully creating muscle. So carbohydrate usage is burning energy, which is not growing. And then increasing rate of fat usage is getting rid of adipose tissue. So growth hormone is basically to build up your body. So taking in amino acids. Prolactin, milk production in females. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to stimulate your thyroid hormone. Typically, we'll just say thyroid hormone, and we mean T3 and T4, and we'll talk about T3 and T4 later on. So stimulate your thyroid gland to secrete thyroid hormone. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, that's going to secrete cortisol and other glucocorticoids from your adrenal cortex. And we'll talk about where your adrenal cortex is. It sits on top of your kidneys later on. Cortisol is your stress hormone. So when you're cramming for midterms, or if you have a stressful situation in life, cortisol is going to be released. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, that's what's going to regulate the menstrual cycles in females or stimulate ovulation in females. It's also going to produce sperm in males. Luteinizing hormone, that's what's also going to cause ovulation in females, as well as sex hormone production in both males and females. All right, pathway for, I didn't advance your slide. All right, pathway for thyrotropin, or thyroid hormones. So we have this thyrotropin releasing hormone that's secreted by the hypothalamus. That thyrotropin releasing hormone is going to go to the anterior pituitary to secrete TSH. Remember, those are called tropic hormones. TSH is going to go to the thyroid gland to secrete thyroid hormone. And that thyroid hormone is going to go to the thyroid itself. And that thyroid hormone will cause the thyroid to secrete the thyroid hormone. And then, it's a negative feedback loop. And basically the primary action of thyroid hormone is to enhance the rate at which proteins are synthesized. So TSH secretion is controlled by two methods in this pathway. It's going to be a negative feedback loop, and it's still controlled by the same extent by the level of TRH. So the thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, as well as the amount of TSH in the body. All right, so here we can see, the hypothalamus releases TRH and stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to secrete TSH into the bloodstream. TSH stimulates the secretion of certain thyroid hormones by the thyroid gland. The thyroid hormones stimulate target cells, and the thyroid hormones inhibit TRH from the hypothalamus and TSH from the anterior pituitary gland. We do have, when we're talking about growth hormone, we do have deficiencies or growth hormones, ups and downs. Too much growth hormone and too little growth hormone. Hypopituitary dwarfism, gigantism, and acromegaly. Hypopituitary dwarfism is caused by a deficiency of human growth hormone during childhood. That's when pretty much everything is short. You are short-statured, but all of your limbs are still proportionally correct. So your arms are still proportional to your legs. It just looks like everything has been shrunk down. Your mental acuity is still there. With gigantism versus acromegaly, we talked about that in chapter 7, I believe. Gigantism and acromegaly are both too much growth hormone. Gigantism is too much growth hormone during childhood, and acromegaly is too much growth hormone during adulthood. The gigantism is usually caused by a pituitary tumor that causes an oversecretion of growth hormone, so that all of your long bones kind of grow abnormally long and causes you to be really, really tall, sometimes over 8 feet. And usually you don't live, well into your 40s with gigantism, because you do have a lot of metabolic problems with gigantism. Acromegaly doesn't show up until adulthood. And remember, your bones are completely ossified, sometimes somewhere around 23 to 25 years old. And then you develop this condition called acromegaly, where you have an overproduction of growth hormone after your bones have ossified. So you don't have an increase in your height, but your bones can still grow in width. So a lot of these people will have, very prominent, thickened facial features, prominent, thickened fingers, enlargement of like some of your endocrine glands, your hands, feet, jaw, stuff like that. All right, so moving on to the posterior pituitary hormones. So remember, these are really controlled by your nervous system itself. Still coming from the hypothalamus, but we say that they have, that the posterior lobe has these nerve fibers or neurosecretory cells, whereas the anterior lobe has more glandular epithelium. And we only have two hormones in the posterior pituitary gland, and they are stored and released in the posterior pituitary. And the two hormones are ADH and oxytocin. For ADH, we can say antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin. So antidiuretic hormone, anti means opposite or against. Diuretic kind of means to pee. So if you have an antidiuretic, antidiuretic means so anti-pee or to not pee. So if I have an antidiuretic, that's going to be something that holds urine. So you have a decreased urine production. So this is where the kidneys are going to hold on to water. And also it causes vasoconstriction to increase blood pressure. And I mentioned before that you can give this as a medication, typically in the ICU setting, to increase blood pressure. So it causes vasoconstriction. So not only does it hold on to water to increase your blood volume, but it will also vasoconstrict to increase your blood pressure. So it has a dual effect. As a side note, ADH deficiency can cause a condition called diabetes insipidus. And alcohol inhibits the secretion of ADH. So that is why you have to urinate after just drinking a few beers. Oxytocin stimulates muscle contraction in the uterine wall during childbirth. So your body produces oxytocin naturally, and typically during a vaginal birth or a cesarean, we will give you oxytocin as well to kind of help you along. And also oxytocin will help cause milk ejection during lactation. And that's responsible for, so like if you hear, if a lactating mom hears a baby's cry, even if it's not her own baby, she'll start to lactate. But oxytocin hasn't really been studied a lot in males, but it can help with sperm movement or sexual response. And if you remember, I told you about the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, but we have that that intermediate lobe in fetal development called the pars intermedia. So let's say you have a cyst that develops in that pars media or pars intermedia. And that resulting that cyst puts pressure on the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So you have a defective hormonal dysfunction or production, secretion. Um, you would see alterations in your oxytocin and ADH production. So if you have a cyst in that area, you could have overproduction of oxytocin and you might be at risk for going into preterm labor. So we might opt to do a C-section instead of a vaginal birth. You might have you would be placed on high risk labor or have abnormal labor. You might have a low response, a low production of oxytocin. You might have weak uterine contractions. So we would probably opt for a C-section as opposed to a vaginal birth. Okay. Okay, so here are some of your here are the anterior and posterior lobe hormones with their actions and kind of their sources of control. I'm not going to read those to you. We kind of talked about most of these throughout the lecture. Your thyroid gland. Thyroid gland kind of sits about right here. It's just below your larynx, anterior and lateral to the trachea. It has two lobes that is connected by this thing called an isthmus. There is your isthmus right there. Oh, can't do blue. I like red. All right, so there's your isthmus right there. Here's your larynx, and there's one lobe and two lobes. So your thyroid is surrounded by these secretory cells called follicles or follicular cells. So these are your follicular cells right here that kind of just surround these things called colloids, and then we have extra follicular cells or outside the follicle cells. And this colloid fills these cavities. So these are kind of cavities right here. You can see the colloid right here with these follicular cells. And then you have the extra follicular cells that are outside of this little circle right here. So there's more extra follicular cells. All right, so the thyroid gland, its function is to basically remove iodine from the blood, and it uses that iodine to produce the thyroid hormones. We have three thyroid hormones, T3, T4, and calcitonin. T3 and T4 are produced by these follicular cells, the ones that surround that space, and calcitonin is produced by these extra follicular cells. So calcitonin, extra follicular, T3 and T4 follicular cells. And T4 can be converted into T3 in the peripheral tissues, or T4 is converted into T3 in the peripheral tissues. And then thyroid hormone basically increases the metabolic rate, meaning that it increases the rate at which cells release energy from carbohydrates. enhances the rate of protein synthesis, and stimulates the breakdown and mobilization of lipids. And it also helps determine our BMR, our basal metabolic rate. We'll talk a little bit more about BMR in a future chapter. I believe it's next chapter, maybe. All right. All right, so here we have our T3, T4, and calcitonin. Overall, these three hormones enhance the rate at which proteins are synthesized. We do have some diseases, hyperthyroidism and diseases that affect, too much thyroid and too little thyroid hormones. You will need to know the symptoms of hyperthyroidism. And you will need to know the symptoms of Graves' disease. With infantile hypothyroidism, it's actually caused by a deficiency of thyroid hormones at birth. Here you can just see some pictures. That's infantile hypothyroidism right here. Here is Graves' disease. Here is a goiter. You can see with both hyper and hypothyroidism, you can see enlargement of the thyroid gland. So just because you have a goiter doesn't necessarily mean you have hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism. Additional testing will be needed, but you can see the presence of a goiter with hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism. Now, your parathyroid glands, they are located on the back side or the posterior side of your thyroid. So here's looking at the back of the thyroid gland. You can see there's 4 parathyroid glands. And they secrete only one hormone called the parathyroid hormone, or PTH, or parathormone. I've never heard it called parathormone. Basically, PTH regulates calcium and phosphorus concentrations in the blood. So typically they work in opposite directions. If you have an increased blood level of calcium, you can see decreased phosphates, but they act on the bones and kidneys and intestines to exert its effects. So we have you can act on bones to stimulate bone resorption. We have, vitamin D metabolism. So, this is where sunlight comes into play. Vitamin D is actually called cholecalciferol. Vitamin D synthesis begins when the intestinal enzymes convert dietary cholesterol into the inactive form of provitamin D, or dehydrocholesterol. And this provitamin is largely stored in the skin. And exposure to ultraviolet light converts it to vitamin D. And the liver changes the vitamin D into hydroxycholecalciferol, where it goes to the kidney to be converted to the active form of vitamin D, dihydroxycholecalciferol, or calcitriol, as long as PTH is present, and this enhances calcium absorption from the small intestine. So if you have osteoporosis or something like that, if you're on calcium supplements, chances are you're going to be on vitamin D supplements as well, because vitamin D, once activated into calcitriol or dihydroxycholecalciferol, you will, this is going to increase or vitamin D will enhance calcium absorption in the small intestine. So if you're on calcium supplements, you're going to be on vitamin D supplements as well, or you should be. And if you have a complete thyroid removal, so after a complete thyroidectomy, you're going to need to be on these cholecalciferol supplements as well. Now, when you do a thyroidectomy, you can actually save your parathyroid glands. Sometimes they will relocate your parathyroid glands. They can put them in either like your forearm, or they can put them in your abdomen, and your parathyroid glands will still work. All right, moving on. So here's PTH and calcium absorption. So here, intestinal enzymes convert the cholesterol from the food to the inactive provitamin D. Ultraviolet light in the skin converts provitamin D to vitamin D, which is called cholecalciferol. It's also obtained directly from foods. The liver changes the vitamin D to hydroxycholecalciferol, which can be changed in the kidneys into the active form of vitamin D, dihydroxycholecalciferol. And this step needs PTH in order to do so. And the active vitamin D controls absorption of calcium from the intestine. Parathyroid glands on the posterior of the thyroid. Decreased blood calcium stimulates parathyroid hormone secretion into the bloodstream. PTH stimulates bone to release calcium ions, and active vitamin D activates vitamin D. The active vitamin D, or vitamin D3, stimulates the intestines to absorb calcium ions and release to the bloodstream. Increased blood calcium inhibits PTH secretion. So the primary control for the secretion of PTH is blood calcium levels. And if you remember from the skeletal system chapter, if we have hypercalcemia, or too much calcium in the blood, the thyroid is going to sense that the calcium is too high. The thyroid is going to essentially release calcitonin, and in the bones, we're going to have this. We're going to deposit calcium in the bones, and the blood calcium levels are going to go down. With hypocalcemia, or too little calcium in the blood, the parathyroid is going to sense that the calcium is too low. The parathyroid releases PTH, and we're going to release calcium from the bones, and the blood calcium is going to go up. Now, if your parathyroid gland has a defect that prevents PTH secretion, you're going to remain hypocalcemic, and therefore the amount of calcium ions and phosphate ions in the blood will remain low or decrease. All right, so hypoparathyroidism and hyperparathyroidism. Basically, the most common cause of hyperparathyroidism is going to be a tumor. And you will need to know the symptoms of hypoparathyroidism. You'll need to know the symptoms of those. Muscle cramps, seizures are going to be the two symptoms that you'll need to know. All right, adrenal glands. So adrenal glands, we also call them suprarenal glands because they sit on top of the kidney. They look like a little hat that sit on top of the kidney. We have different hormones that are produced by the adrenal glands. Basically, they're going to be responsible for maintaining your sodium levels, your stress levels, and your sex hormones. And we have two different portions. We have a cortex and a medulla. Looking at the cortex, we have three different zones or areas that produce different hormones. We have an outer zone called the zona glomerulosa, and that's going to produce aldosterone and mineralocorticoids. We have a middle zone called a zona fasciculata, and that's going to produce cortisol and other glucocorticoids. That's going to be used for fat and protein metabolism. And we have an inner zone called a zona reticularis. And that's where your sex hormones, male sex hormones or androgens are going to be produced. Your adrenal glands, we already said aldosterone, cortisol, androgens, estrogens. That's going to be stimulated by ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So adrenal, cortico, cortex, tropic, remember it's a tropic hormone. So that's kind of like the breakdown of ACTH. Adrenal medulla, that's the inside. That's the central portion of the gland. So going back to this slide, you have your your cortex is on the outside, and the medulla is going to be kind of like the inner layer right here. So that's your medulla, and this is your cortex. So cortex and medulla. All right, so medulla is going to secrete these amine hormones called catecholamine. And if we look at the pathway, basically we're going to start with tyrosine, we're going to go to dopamine. So tyrosine is going to get converted to dopamine, and dopamine is going to get converted into norepinephrine and then to epinephrine. Epinephrine and both epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to act on these alpha and beta receptors. If you heard of like beta blockers, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. But we have alpha and beta receptors, and both epinephrine and norepinephrine work on alpha and beta receptors. However, norepinephrine will have a greater affinity for alpha receptors. And you can see that epinephrine is about 80% in our body, 20% is norepinephrine. We can say epinephrine is the equivalent to adrenaline. So if you get an adrenaline rush, that's epinephrine. Norepinephrine, we also call it noradrenaline. I will go back to the aldosterone, cortisone, stuff like that. Aldosterone helps regulate blood pressure by managing sodium and potassium in your blood, and it impacts your blood volume. Cortisol, I said earlier, was your stress hormone. It's basically going to increase sugar or glucose in the bloodstream. And it also enhances the brain's use of glucose. And it increases the availability of substances in the body that repair tissues. Epinephrine, we'll see, might be on the next slide. Epinephrine is going to induce increased vascular smooth muscle contraction, pupillary dilator muscle contraction, intestinal sphincter contraction. So think of, and norepinephrine increases heart rate, blood pumping from the heart. So with epinephrine and norepinephrine, kind of think of, what happens when you meet the bear in the middle of the woods. So here's a chart of, what happens with epinephrine and norepinephrine. So this is, think of your sympathetic nervous system. This is what happens when you meet the bear in the middle of the woods. Your heart rate increases. Your heart starts pumping. More vigorously. Your blood vessels, they're going to vasodilate. You have to get ready for fight or flight. Your blood pressure is going to increase because you now have this increased cardiac output. We'll talk about cardiac output in a couple chapters when we talk about the cardiovascular system. Your airways are going to dilate. You're going to get ready to run away from the bear. Or fight the bear. You need that increased lung volume to be able to get ready for that. Your reticular activating system is or your reticular system is now activated. You have to be able to process everything. Your liver is going to break up that glycogen into glucose so that you can have that energy to either run away or from the bear or to fight the bear. Your metabolic rate is going to increase. So, like I said, think of what's going to happen when you meet the bear, and that's pretty much your sympathetic nervous system. All right, aldosterone. I said that aldosterone helps regulate the blood pressure by managing sodium and potassium in your blood and impacting the blood volume. But aldosterone, it conserves conserves sodium and excretes potassium. And remember that wherever sodium goes, water will follow. So because we are conserving energy, water is going to be conserved as well. So aldosterone kind of works the same way as antidiuretic hormone in that it retains fluid. Different mechanism, of course, but aldosterone is going to retain sodium and therefore water. We have this thing called a renin-angiotensin system that's going to help with our blood pressure. We'll briefly look at it. We're not going to go in depth into the renin-angiotensin or the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Some people say the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. That's going to be more nursing school in-depthness. We'll just kind of briefly go over it. Here, you have a decreasing blood pressure and or sodium ion concentration. It's going to stimulate the secretion of this enzyme renin. And renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, which is converted to angiotensin 2 by this enzyme called ACE, or angiotensin converting enzyme. And angiotensin 2 stimulates the adrenocortical cells to secrete aldosterone, and aldosterone is going to then act on the kidney to conserve sodium ions, and therefore water is going to follow sodium. So we're going to hold on to sodium and hold on to water. And now, because we have that increased blood volume, our blood pressure and sodium ion concentration is going to hopefully return to normal, inhibiting further secretion of renin. So we have this enzyme called ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, and you've heard of ACE inhibitors to treat hypertension. So they bind to the ACE blocking the formation of angiotensin 2. And then bradykinin, a vasodilator, can now work to lower your blood pressure. So if you have an ACE inhibitor, it's going to kind of block this step right here and basically prevent the conversion of angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2 and hopefully lower your blood pressure. All right, so regulation of cortisol secretion. Your higher brain cells signal the hypothalamus to secrete this CRH, cortisol-releasing hormone, and stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone into the bloodstream, and then the ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. And cortisol affects various target cells. It can stimulate the production of glucose from non-carbohydrates. It can promote fatty acid release. It can inhibit protein synthesis, and cortisol inhibits the secretion of CRH and ACTH. Remember, it's a negative feedback loop. But cortisol can reduce inflammation. So cortisol, it can decrease the permeability of capillaries and prevent the leakage of fluids that surround or that swell the surrounding tissues. Cortisol can stabilize the lysosomal membranes that release, preventing the release of their enzymes that would otherwise destroy tissues. Remember, lysosomes are the garbage disposal of the cell, and they dump out their contents and kind of eat up the cellular debris. So cortisol would help stabilize those cell membranes. And cortisol inhibit prostaglandin synthesis. Remember, we talked about prostaglandins earlier on in the lecture. All right, summary slide of aldosterone, cortisol, and adrenal androgens. So fight or flight, what happens? Your body wants to protect itself. Cortisol is going to inhibit protein synthesis in various tissues. So it's going to increase the blood concentration of amino acids. It's going to stimulate your liver cells to synthesize glucose. That's called gluconeogenesis. Synthesize new glucose, gluconeogenesis, and it's going to promote fatty acid release to use as body energy so that the brain can use the glucose for the neuron's energy source. Remember from the neuro chapters, the brain cannot use anything but glucose as their energy source. Remember, the body is good about using carbs, lipids, and proteins and kind of convert everything into energy source, but the brain can only use glucose. So for this slide, you will need to know the action of cortisol. And cortisol is useful in controlling inflammatory reaction because cortisol decreases the permeability of capillaries. All right, disorders of the adrenal cortex. We have Addison's disease and Cushing's syndrome, just to name two. There's plenty of others. Addison's disease is a hyposecretion or insufficient hormone from the adrenal cortex. It's usually going to be cortisol and aldosterone. And that results from electrolyte, glucose imbalances, dehydration, low blood pressure, fatigue, nausea, increased skin pigmentation. So overall, we're going to have decreased blood sodium levels. And this could be fatal because, sodium is very vital. And we do have a electrolyte imbalance. But basically, with Addison's disease, it's going to result in decreased sodium blood levels. And if we go back to what aldosterone does, it conserves energy. Or I keep saying energy, conserves sodium. So if we have decreased aldosterone, we're going to pee out more sodium and excrete more sodium. So we're going to have a lower blood sodium content. All right, with Cushing's syndrome, it's usually a hypersecretion of cortisol, usually because of an adrenal tumor, or excess production of ACTH by the anterior pituitary. So we have too much cortisol or too much stress hormone. So with your stress hormone, you're going to see muscle wasting, bone loss, increased blood glucose levels, sodium retention, water retention, because remember, water follows sodium. Because of the increased blood volume, we're going to have increased blood pressure, puffy skin, But one characteristic of Cushing syndrome is that you're going to have this abnormal deposit of adipose tissue on the back of your, at the upper part of your back and your neck. It's usually called a hump. But you can see some increased adipose tissue in your face as well. Pancreas is an elongated, flat, and posterior to your stomach. So it's going to lie in your like mid to left rib cage. And basically, it's going to transport digestive juices to your small intestine, to the duodenum. And it has, remember, your pancreas falls under the digestive system and the endocrine system, but it actually has endocrine function and exocrine gland function. It's an endocrine function because it secretes hormones directly into the body fluids or bloodstream, like insulin, and then also has exocrine gland functions because these digestive juices go through the pancreatic duct down into the digestive system. So we have three hormones that we're going to talk about, and they are secreted from these cells called the pancreatic islets, or the islets of Langerhans. Glucagon, insulin, and somatostatin. So glucagon are secreted by these alpha cells, and glucagon increases concentrations of blood glucose. Glucagon is a protein that stimulates the liver to break down glycogen into glucose. So remember, the suffix to break down is lysis. So if we're breaking down glycogen, we would say glycogenolysis. So glycogen is a protein that stimulates the liver to break down glycogen into glucose. So glycogenolysis, and convert non-carbohydrates, such as amino acids, into glucose. So now we're creating new glucose, gluconeogenesis. Insulin is another hormone. So insulin is secreted by these beta cells, and they're going to decrease blood glucose concentrations. And insulin is just a protein. Protein is just amino acids that stimulate the liver to form glycogen from glucose and inhibit the conversion of non-carbohydrates into glucose. And somatostatin is secreted by these delta cells, and they inhibit the secretion of insulin and glucagon. So here you can see the pancreas, and it's going into the small intestine. Here you can see the islet cells. All right, so hormones of the pancreatic islets, we've already talked about the glucagon, insulin, and somatostatin. And by now you should know the action of glucagon and insulin. We've talked about that enough throughout AMP1 that you should know these inside and out. Somatostatin we haven't talked about, but helps regulate carbs. But it also shuts off both insulin and glucagon. So here, after a meal, blood glucose increases in the pancreatic islets. Insulin secretion increases, and glucagon secretion decreases. You have cellular uptake of glucose and the formation of glycogen. And then in between meals, blood glucose decreases in the pancreatic islets, insulin secretion decreases, and glucagon secretion increases. Glycogen is now broken down into glucose, and non-carbohydrates are converted into glucose. All right, diabetes. It's a metabolic disease, lack of insulin or the ability of the cells to recognize insulin. It's an immune system disorder. There is some research out there to suggest that it might be a viral disorder. but right now, immune system. But basically, elevated blood glucose can damage, your eyes, heart, kidneys, nerves. Um, Altered carbohydrate, protein, fat metabolism. A lot of us already know what goes on with diabetes. We have glucose that is poorly uptake by the cells. Typically, insulin will help that glucose uptake into adipose and muscle cells, but in diabetes, those carbs or that glucose cannot enter cells in normal quantities. I'll just change that to glucose, and that's going to result in hyperglycemia or high blood glucose. And then because of that, we have to look at other forms of energy usage. And in true diabetes, if you see someone who's truly a diabetic, like a type 1 diabetic, you're going to see a really fast decline in weight. You're going to see their hunger. They're going to be hungry a lot, tired. Their wounds aren't going to heal well. Their growth, if they're a child, their growth is going to stop. There's 3 signs that you're going to look for: polydipsia, polyphagia, polyuria. You're going to drink a lot, eat a lot, and pee a lot. So glucose is going to spill into the urine. It's called glucosuria, and then water is going to follow by osmosis. So that's your polyuria. And that's going to lead to dehydration and thirst. So that's your polydipsia, too much drinking. And then urine is going to have a high osmotic pressure. And we'll talk about osmotic pressure, I believe it's next chapter, in a couple chapters. All right, so we know that there's type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is basically insulin dependent diabetes. Usually we see this at before 20 years of age for onset. It is an autoimmune disease where the beta cells of the pancreas are destroyed, and that we typically have a lack of insulin production. Type 2 diabetes, it's not that we don't have insulin production, it's usually that the insulin that we do produce, the cells don't have a sensitivity to that insulin. And that's going to be the majority of the cases that we see as type 2 diabetes, is that the body is unable to recognize that insulin that we do produce. So how do we treat it? Type 1 diabetics are going to have to require insulin. Remember that the pancreas does not produce insulin because the beta cells are destroyed. That insulin can be obtained from pigs, cattle. We do have an inhaled form of insulin. We're looking at other ways to deliver insulin. We have an insulin pump so that you don't have to, inject yourself every time. You see the things on the back of people's arms that can measure your blood glucose reading, so you don't have to prick your finger and test your blood sugar anymore. We are looking at, other countries are looking at doing pancreatic islet transplantations. We aren't doing that in the United States yet. So for treating type 2 diabetes, basically, carbs get broken down into sugar. So get rid of the sugar, get rid of the carbs, and eat more protein. Get exercise, take medicines that will decrease glucose production. And I thought it was interesting that the book said gastric bypass surgery. So gastric bypass surgery is typically only, indicated for people over, 400 to 600 pounds. And so try and do the exercise before you go for the gastric bypass surgery. So, with type 1 diabetics, without treatment, fatty acids and ketone bodies will accumulate in the blood. If you've heard of diabetic ketoacidosis, DKA, That's when you have these ketone bodies that are going to be building up in your bloodstream. All right, some other glands, the pineal gland, it's going to be found in the brain. It's actually attached to the thalamus. It's going to secrete melatonin. Melatonin helps regulates our circadian rhythms. Our circadian rhythm lets us know if it's daylight or nighttime, when we should be awake, when we should be asleep. Our thymus gland is kind of found in between our lungs, kind of about right here. Um, we looked at it in AMP1. Secretes these things called thymosins. It's actually good for production and differentiation of our white blood cells. Remember our lymphocytes, our T lymphocytes, um, and for immunity. And as we get older, our thymus gland gets replaced by adipose tissue. And other glands in our reproductive organs, the ovaries produce estrogen, progesterone, testes produce testosterone, our digestive glands, our heart, and our kidneys. We'll talk about the natriuretic peptides when we talk about the cardiovascular system. We've already talked about erythropoietin to stimulate red blood cell formation. So stress. So survival is going to be dependent on homeostasis. Everything goes back to homeostasis. We have changes every millisecond in our internal and external environment that are potentially life-threatening, and we have to do what we can to minimize the effects of those changes. And we have sensory receptors that are going to send those impulses to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus kind of oversees everything and determines from a nervous system perspective what needs to happen, and that the hypothalamus is going to be the controller of the endocrine system to stimulate the endocrine gland to do or not do something. And we have different types of stress. We have good stress and bad stress, but here we're going to talk about the bad stress, and we can break it up into physical stress and psychological stress. Physical stress is temperature extremes, infection, injury, oxygen deficiency. Psychological stress, if you're in danger, if you've just lost a loved one, or if you're feeling anger, or if you're in fear of something. And how we respond to stress is based on the hypothalamus. And we have this thing called a general adaptation syndrome or a general stress syndrome. The first phase is going to be an alarm phase, and that's kind of like our fight or flight response. That's pretty much immediate, and it doesn't last very long. We have that sympathetic nervous system, and those are going to provide impulses that do pretty much everything that this chart says. We're going to increase our blood glucose, increase fatty acids, increase our heart rate, increase our breathing rate, increase our blood pressure, dilate our air passages, shunt blood to skeletal muscles, increase epinephrine production. Epinephrine is going to intensify and prolong these responses. Then we're going to fall into the resistance stage. So this is, after the immediate threat is over, if we still continue to experience stress. So this would be, more psychological stress or long-term abuse, long-term depression, long-term whatever stress you're experiencing. Your CRH, ACTH, cortisol pathway, you're going to have a prolonged secretion of cortisol. And remember, cortisol is your stress hormone. So cortisol, glucagon, growth hormone are going to mobilize the energy sources. You're going to have ADH and water that's going to cause, or ADH and renin that's going to cause water retention. blood concentrations of epinephrine, cortisol, ATH, a lot of these are going to increase. You can see here in the alarm stage, stress from changes in the internal or external environment. Signals from sensory receptors stimulate the hypothalamus. Sympathetic impulses to the adrenal medulla cause the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Sympathetic impulses, oh, I didn't change your slide. Sympathetic impulses directly induce the release of norepinephrine. Short-term fight or flight. And then we have the short-term fight or flight alarm stage. Blood glucose increases. Blood glycerol and fatty acids increase, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, your air passage dilates, your pupils dilate, your blood flow redistributes. And then we have the resistance stage, where your stress signals from your sensory receptors stimulate the hypothalamus to release this CRH. And the anterior pituitary releases ACTH, which stimulates the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. And you can see, then we have this thing called the long-term adjustment or resistance stage, where your blood concentration of amino acids increase, release of fatty acids increase, glucose formed from non-carbohydrate sources, amino acids from proteins, and glycerol from fatty acids are all going to increase. And then if we still don't take care of ourselves, we're going to go into the exhaustion phase. The exhaustion phase is going to begin, months. This is months of abuse, months of depression, months of being stressed out, months of ACTH, months of cortisol. We're going to see electrolyte imbalances, immune system suppression, wasting syndrome, and it can result in death. So take care of yourself. Only you can take care of yourself. I'm a big advocate for mental health. So here's just a summary of major events in the general stress syndrome. Basically, remember that ACTH is going to be the regulator of cortisol, and some lifespan changes. With everything, endocrine glands are going to decrease in size. Your muscle skeletal strengths are going to decrease. Your growth hormone levels are going to decline overall. So, after you're born, we're going to go through growth spurts, and then, your growth hormone increases in puberty, and then it's going to level off after adolescence, and then it's going to start to decline after about 40 years old. Your ADH levels, or your anti-P levels, are going to increase due to slower elimination by the liver and kidneys. Your calcitonin levels are going to decrease, increasing the risk of osteoporosis. And we're going to have PTH level changes, increasing the risk of osteoporosis, especially in females, and especially once females are post-menopausal, hence the need for hormonal replacement therapy. Insulin resistance may develop. Changes in melatonin may affect the body clock, and our thymosin production declines, mainly because our thymus gets converted into, or about 80% of our thymus gets converted into adipose tissue. All right, so like I said, that was a long chapter. We are done with the endocrine chapter. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time.